The Capriccio Stravagante is a strange piece. It says so on its title page. It advertises itself as einem kurzweiligen Quodlibet von allerhand seltsamen Inventionen. That is a diverting or entertaining or humorous quodlibet, there's no direct translation for that, full of all kinds of curious or strange or peculiar, outlandish, remarkable inventions. I titled my talk today Curious Inventions rather than strange or outlandish inventions for the double sense both of curious in the Alice in Wonderland sense of curiouser and curiouser, these striking and unusual effects, and more of the connotation that's in invention of human curiosity and investigation.
Hang on just 1 second, we've lost.
No, that's intentional. Lane said he'd just
She's
the
there.
picture
Oh,
from
okay,
time to
so
time.
she is there. Okay,
Yeah.
sorry.
She's back there.
He can still there.
Okay.
The content of the Capriccio ranges from the sublime to the grotesque. By the way, Lane, if we could get a little bit more volume. Sure. To the outright ridiculous. The piece is written for 4 bowed string instruments, most likely a violin, 2 violas, and a cello, or at least the early 17th century version of what would later be a violoncello. Over the course of the piece, these string instruments are called on to imitate the timbres of other instruments, trumpets, shawms, organs, and guitars, as well as the sounds of several animals, chickens, the cats that we heard, and dogs. The Capriccio Stravagante was written by the Italian violinist Carlo Farina, and was published in 1627 in Dresden, where he was employed at the time. He published it in a collected volume with various other pavans, galliards, and dance pieces, but the title of the volume highlights the Capriccio as a particular feature. The title page is in German, and so refers to the piece as the Kurzweiligen Quodlibet, but if you turn into the book, you find the Italian title, the Capriccio Stravagante. A reasonable question at the outset is, why is this piece worth studying? Well, up until recently, it hasn't been considered worth studying in any significant way. Quite a few voices from 1869 up until now have given it passing mention, but never more than a few paragraphs at a time. And Dr. Cypess wrote an article last year that's pretty much longer than all prior discussion of the piece put together. But so, at least in these cases, why is it worth passing mention? Typically for this idea of an evolutionary merit to the piece, in which the Capriccio either advances violin technique or anticipates later violin technique. But that, we'll get into, is ultimately a problematic idea, so perhaps a better reason would be that the Capriccio represents a useful vehicle for examining these instruments that are represented in it. Though there isn't a whole lot, there's a little bit, but not much that it can tell us that we can't already learn from other sources. But at least for the layman, like me, picking it up, who doesn't know what a shawm is or what a lira di braccio is, it's a good jumping off point for investigating Baroque instruments. I gave a very different lecture a couple of years ago, just called a Baroque Instrument Petting Zoo with the Duke Instrument Collection. they got to feature some of their versions of these instruments that they had. But ultimately, a sort of more impactful way of looking at the Capriccio is for its ability to stand as an example of a certain mindset within early 17th century instrumental writing, the stravaganza that it refers to in the title, a school of instrumental writing that we could refer to as the stile moderno. We'll talk more about that in just a moment. One important facet of the piece is the fact that Farina left fairly explicit text instructions on how it should be performed. These were consisted of about a page each of Italian and German. I pulled a little bit of sleight of hand here. They weren't actually facing. The Italian page comes first. And are referred to as a few avvertimenti, or necessary reminders. So in the future, I'll just refer to them as avvertimenti. These are indeed necessary reminders because Farina painstakingly explains such commonplace modern features as first and second endings, double stops, slurs, and playing above first position. But he also provides very precise instructions. For instance, the section labeled Il Flatino, he says, should be played ponticello with the bow exactly half a finger's width away from the bridge. And more helpfully, Farina's avvertimenti provide clear clues to the identities of some of the instruments he imitates, even those about which there has been some misunderstanding. The first thing that we have to do when looking at the Capriccio is to come to terms with the use that we make of it. We have to make sense of the piece in some way and to find or assign a function to it. And ultimately, what we get out of the piece will depend on the function that we decide on. For most of the commenters up until a few years ago, the 19th and early 20th century comments, these typically centered around this supposed evolutionary value for the piece, in which the piece's artistic faults are excused because, in the words of Wilhelm Wasilewski, composition for the violin was still in its childhood, and in the words of his son, Waldemar, the time was not yet ripe for the expression of poetic sentiments in music, which has blossomed with such wondrous beauty in the instrumental works of our heroes of art. A model like this imagines Farina to be conscious of his benighted primitivism and to have, quote, the technical development of this instrument uppermost in his mind, to be anxious to do his part to bring about the wondrous blossom of the Romantic period heroes of art, which of course he could not see from his vantage point. Some of these commenters, like Wasilewski and Paul Stoving, suggest that the piece's functional value is as a valuable document of the obviously manifest violin technique of the time, while others, like Edmund van der Struyten, see the piece more as an initial germination of techniques that would be more commonly used in later centuries, the first germs of our present violin literature, or first random trials and experimental uses of the violin by trying to find new effects which nobody else had tried before. Note that these latter views make an assumption that is directly opposite to Wasilewski's. Rather than documenting techniques that were already manifest in early 17th century practice, the Capriccio is supposed to be inventing new ones for the benefit of later centuries. Most of these commenters are also fairly hard on the Capriccio as an aesthetic object. Boris Schwartz says that there is no use pretending that it had musical value. And one of the actually latest comments in 1990, Billy Appel says the Capriccio Stravagante is best forgotten. But they apologize for talking about it at all on the basis of its technical value. Quote, helpful coincidences. It is little likely that the Capriccio Stravagante had become a reference model, or even simply a vague source of inspiration over an area so vast and after so many years. So one way that we could construct a vantage point to make sense of the Capriccio is to view it within the contemporary practice of the stile moderno. We have a little gallery here of some of Farina's contemporaries, most of whom we don't have portraits for. We just haven't had one for Antonio Bertali. The stile moderno, it would be misleading to call it a school, since fairly sure that there's no evidence that Freyna had contact with any of these, though he did grow up near Marini and Rossi. And I'm not sure how much evidence there is that any of them had contact with each other. But you could describe it as a pervasive compositional philosophy. Dr. Cypess says it's characterized by idiomatic instrumental writing for one particular instrument, instrumental virtuosity, quick changes in harmonic vocabulary, flexibility in part writing and rules of dissonance treatment, and the introduction of basso continuo as a driving force in a polarized soprano and bass texture. And the virtuosity is exactly what some of these 19th century commenters regretted so much about the Capriccio, calling it out-and-out stunts designed to delight the public. But within the Stile Moderno, such stunts were actually part of an overall aesthetic structure. Another analogy for examining Capriccio is that of the Kunstkammer. Freyna's employer, the Elector of Saxony in Dresden, had assembled a large Kunstkammer, literally an art room, which was not so much a gallery of pictorial art, but a collection also of curiosities of natural beauty and human ingenuity, like these drinking vessels made from nautilus shells. The collection, which by now includes enlargements made by later electors such as Augustus the Strong, is today housed in the historic Green Vault, and the rooms are as stunning as their contents. So this model could conceive of the Capriccio as a collection or an exhibit of these imitated instruments and these techniques. They're set off and framed by the non-representational material. Dr. Cypess also discusses the Capriccio as a theater of machines. There were these sort of coffee table books of illustrated mechanical inventions put out in the 17th century, just as edificational pieces. And perhaps Freyna's Encyclopedia of Instruments here is a similar collection of mechanical devices on display. And finally, there's the possibility that the Capriccio might have been written as a wedding gift to the elector's daughter. One use of the word invention refers to the spectacular public processions designed to display the power and knowledge of the elector. And these parades were often organized to celebrate major occasions in the life of the court. And when Freyna dedicated this volume that was published on January 1st, 1627, he dedicated the volume to Johann Georg's wife, the Electress Magdalena Sibylla, at the very moment when the court would have been preparing for the wedding of her daughter. One other vantage point for interpreting the Capriccio comes from a contemporary of Freyna's, Marin Mersenne, the French philosopher. And he doesn't speak directly of the Capriccio, but he has several passages about the violin's ability to imitate the timbres of instruments, animals, that could almost be described in the Capriccio. He says, for instance, "But the violin has this above the other instruments, that in addition to various songs of animals, both bird and land animals, it imitates and counterfeits all sorts of instruments, such as voices, organs, the hurdy-gurdy, the bagpipe, the fife, etc., so that it can provoke sadness as does the lute, or enliven like the trumpet. And those who know how to play it to perfection are able to represent everything that comes to their imagination." Mersenne talks about the violin borrowing the affects or modes that belong to other instruments. He uses this word mode in several ways simultaneously, both talking about a music theory sense, the ability for the violin to modulate chromatically through different keys, and to adjust the enharmonic differences of the temperaments on the fly, since it doesn't have frets. And it's the violin's emotional capacity as a result. he describes modes as affects. He says, now if one wishes to leave the names by which the ancients expressed their modes, that is the Dorian, Phrygian, Lydian, Ionian, and the others, and should wish to impose more intelligible names on them than those of the Greeks, the tone or mode of the violin can be called the gay or joyous mode, and that of the viol and lyre, the sad and languishing mode, that of the lute, the prudent and modest mode, that of the trumpet, the hardy and warlike tone, and so the others, according to the property of each instrument. It must be noted that the violin is capable of all the genres and all the species of music, and that one can play the enharmonic and each species of the diatonic and chromatic upon it because it carries no frets, and contains all the intervals imaginable, which is comparable to the primal matter, capable of all sorts of forms and figures. Thus it must be concluded that it contains an infinity of different tones, as the string or the line contains an infinity of points, and consequently that it can be called universal harmony. And finally, Mersenne concludes by crowning the violin the king of instruments on the basis of this versatility and effective power. He says, the violin is one of the simplest instruments that can be imagined because it has only 4 strings and is without frets on its neck. This makes it more perfect than the fretted instruments. And the beauties and graces that are practiced on it are so great in number that it can be preferred to all the other instruments, since the strokes of the bow are so delightful sometimes that one has a great discontent to hear the end, particularly when they are mixed with ornamentations of the left hand, which force the listeners to confess the violin to be king of the instruments. So the significance of this passage to the Capriccio is the possibility that Farina is using this imitative, this mimetic genre to help define the violin at a time that the violin is still being defined. Moving on to Farina himself, there's much we don't know for certain about Farina's life. We have no portrait, no baptism record, but really what matters is not the details of Farina's biography or the Capriccio's purported direct influence on other pieces, but the place that both of them held in broad international movements of taste, instrumental writing, and national influences. Farina had a remarkable career across Europe, from his birthplace in Mantua to Dresden, ultimately as far north as what was then Danzig, now Gdansk, and died in Vienna. And Farina represents one person within this overall diaspora of Italian violinists to Germanic courts. Some of his other contemporaries in the Stile Moderno, like Marini, Buonamente, and Bertali, went to some of these same cities, to Vienna and Nuremberg, other Germanic cities. Farina in Dresden was employed by the Elector Johann Georg I, but he was one of many Italians brought to the court by a sort of cabal between the court composer Schutz and the heir to the electorate, Johann Georg II, who was distinctly interested in Italian tastes in music, and together they worked to bring the latest Italian fashions and musicians to the court. I want to take a moment to examine one performance factor of the Capriccio, one difficulty that stands in the way of the modern performer, and that's how to interpret Farina's slur markings. There are several passages, there's Elector Johann Georg I. There are several passages in which Farina prints slurs, but the slurs are problematic. They all seem to be roughly the same size, and if one took a very literal approach to performing them, the result would be somewhat nonsensical. Let's see. Or, let's see, this one is more clear. Taking, for instance, this. section, we see that repeated passages do not get repeated slur patterns. The difficulty here is that Farina is using movable type to print these slurs. And it appears that perhaps only one character for the slur was cast. Almost all these slurs being the same size. They were each just the same chunk of metal type. An alternative to this literal approach would be to regard these slur marks as simply indicating that the passages in question are slurred. And then we're left to construct the bowing in the most logical and historically informed manner possible. And the result tends to be to group the notes by the beat. After all, in close inspection, the slurs are not only equal size, but more or less evenly spaced across the line. Just spread out to say, here are slurs. One very intriguing contemporary source that shows the same kind of pattern is a sonata what Michelini drew in on his manuscript. And you can see here he has slurs typically just by the beat groupings. In one case, isolating the eighth note from a series of shorter notes. But that the printed slurs are simply spaced evenly, equally sized, to show that here are some slurs, even hanging over the bar line. Farina's printer in Dresden, Gimmelbergen, clearly had a number of technical difficulties. Besides slurs, Farina called for double stops in the piece, and obviously he didn't have chunks of type with two notes printed on them, so the second note was actually inked in by hand. You can see the gaps between the metal chunks of type in the staff lines, but one unbroken ledger line there ruled in, and you can see some wear on these notes, but none on these. It's clear that slurring was already a common practice in Italy and Germany. The organist Samuel Scheidt in 1624, 3 years before the Capriccio, used some slurs in his organ music and labeled them as imitatio violistica, imitation of the violin, or perhaps of the viol. And these slurs significantly were 16th notes connected with 4-note slurs, so by the beat. And like Farina, Scheidt published some explanations at the end of his work, and explained when notes are drawn together, as seen here, it is a special style, just as violinists, or perhaps viol players, who know how to play clearly and gently are wont to slur. He uses, by the way, the same German phrase there that Farina does to describe the slurring, mit dem Bogen schleifen, to drag or grind with a bow. He goes on, this manner, which is not uncommon among master violisten, even of the German nation, gives a very charming and graceful effect on the organ. So I myself have fallen in love with it and let myself acquire the habit. So by his testimony, it was already well known in Germany. Even 4 years earlier, Francesco Rognoni in 1620 gives a very complete set of examples of how one might slur certain passages. And in various rhythmic permutations. And these really can be our primary source in figuring out how to interpret Farina's slurs. Rognoni describes them very simply. He says, slurring means to take 2, 3, or more notes in a single bow. If there are 2 notes, then 2 in down bow and 2 in up bow. If there are 3, the same. If 4, then 4 down and 4 up. So this would seem to suggest he's slurring notes by the beat. If eighth notes, then 2 notes at a time. If 16th notes, then 4 at a time. One trend that can be extrapolated from these examples, though, is that most of the slurs end at the end of the beat. That is, say that this one, we have a dotted 8th note, so the slur starts within a beat, but it finishes. These two actually are 16th notes. We have dun, da-da-dun, da-da-dun. Actually, I picked the one exception to my rule. Where's a better example? Here we go. This one concludes right at a beat, so that the next note falls on a beat. In other words, there's not much syncopation. And absolutely none of these slurs cross a bar line. I put that down. Twice is this rule broken, with the syncopated bowing in the measure that ends the first line and ends the second. And also in this measure. So the conclusion for the capriccio is that it's best to simply connect them by the beat. So, for example, this passage would simply be But one more thing to notice about Rognoni's slurs is that in 1620, he's managed to achieve truly readable and useful slurs. Of course, his Italian printer obviously had a much greater stock of characters than Gemo Bergen in Dresden. He has several different lengths of curved slurs, and for the longer ones, he has some arcs at the beginning and end that he can fill in with a straight line. The printer